Causation. One of those things that cause quite a number of students a bit of a headache. Um, in its most basic terms, causation is all about whether the actions or omissions of a defendant cause the injury or death. And it's important in criminal law that the prosecution prove this, because we don't want to punish somebody for something they haven't caused. In the majority of cases, it is pretty obvious that what the defendant has done or failed to do has caused the injury or death. Um, you stab someone, they die. It looks pretty obvious to everybody involved that your stabbing of them has caused the injury or death. However, there are some situations involving negligent medical treatment, an ambulance that takes 2 or 3 hours to get to the scene of a crime. These things can mess a little bit with causation, and the law needs a way to work out, despite these other actions that seem to have had a cause as well, whether the defendant should be held responsible for the death or the injuries that have happened to a person. And what we're going to do, we're going to look at the 3 different things that the law looks at in order to work out if a defendant has caused something. And we're going to start by looking at these in some non-legal terms, just so you can get an idea of how the law on causation works. Now, the 3 parts to causation are as follows. There is factual causation, and this is the first sort of test that we apply to a situation where causation is potentially an issue. And in this we're asking, was the defendant involved at all in the death or injury? Because there are certain situations where, even though a defendant is charged with something, on closer examination of the case, we find out that actually they didn't play any role whatsoever. Now, this isn't usually an issue because we don't usually charge people who don't have anything to do with the case, but it's important that we ask right at the beginning, perhaps the defendant had no involvement whatsoever. The second type of causation that we look at is legal causation. And this is all about how significant the defendant's involvement was in the death or injuries that occurred. Because sometimes there are situations where there might be 2 or 3 or 4 different causes of the death. And so it's important if we work out how significant the defendant's involvement was in it. And the last one is all to do with whether the chain of causation was broken. Sometimes something comes along, another person, the victim might do something slightly crazy or daft. There might be a break in the chain, and so we wouldn't hold the defendant completely responsible for all the consequences of what they might have started. So we're going to look at these in a bit on a simple scenario, just to give you an idea of how they work. So let's look at a little scenario here involving an old friend of mine, Jim. Let me tell you something about Jim. And unfortunately, I found out that Jim, after years of friendship, had been sleeping with my wife, and so I decided to send Jim a text, and my text went like this: I'm watching you, Jim, and I'm going to get you for what you've done. Now, Jim receives this text while he's walking along, and like many of us, he starts looking at his phone. He gets a little bit worried and a little bit concerned, and thinks that I might be in the vicinity. So before he knows what he's done, he's rushed across the road and been knocked down and killed by a bus. I should add that the bus was speeding at the time, going 50 miles an hour in a 30 mile an hour zone. So the question that the law on causation wants to find out and know is, and I want to know it as well, because I'm a bit worried that I'm going to get into trouble for the death of Jim, is, did my action in sending that text cause the death of Jim? And as we've already said, the law breaks causation down into 3 parts. And the first part is factual causation. And here we're really asking, was the defendant involved at all? Was I involved at all in the death of Jim? Now, I'd probably say I had nothing to do with the deaths or injuries whatsoever. But as I've already said, I did send him a text, and that text upset him so much that he ran into the road and got knocked down by a bus. So in terms of factual causation, if I hadn't done that, he would probably still be alive. So in terms of factual causation, it looks like I have caused the death of Jim. But as we said, there are two other parts to look at as well. And the second part is legal causation. And this is where we ask, was the defendant's involvement significant? So was my role in his death significant? Was it more than trivial? And this is where it gets a little bit interesting, because I would say, okay, I was involved. I did send him the text. You've got the record of that. And a few seconds after him getting the text, he did end up under a bus. So I was involved, but my contribution was insignificant. That's what I'd say. And it's up to the courts then, and juries sometimes, to decide how significant my input was into the death of Jim. Okay, so we've got factual causation, we've got legal causation. Looks as if, potentially, I'm still looking as if I might have caused the death. Let's, however, go on to, did the actions of someone else or the victim break the chain? So this part on chain of causation. It could very well be here that I would say the following. The bus and or Jim's crossing the road in the wrong place broke the chain of causation. And it's likely that I wouldn't be found liable for the death of Jim. I've sent him a nasty text, and I could be perhaps charged with something like assault, putting a person in fear of violence. But it's very unlikely, because there's probably a break in the chain of causation. Factual causation. Factual causation is sometimes called the but-for rule, is all about asking the following question. Would the injury or death have happened if it hadn't been for the actions of the defendant? And the best way to understand this is through the very famous case of White. Mr. White decided to poison his mother by putting some arsenic in a glass of water. He left the glass of water by the side of her bed, but Mrs. White never drank the glass of water and instead died of heart failure during the night. He was charged with murder. And in terms of factual causation, the following question was asked. Would Mrs. White's death have happened if it hadn't been for the actions of the defendant? And the answer is yes, it would have happened. It wasn't his poison that killed her, and so potentially there is no factual causation. You'd be pleased to hear that Mr. White was charged with attempted murder. But there are certain situations where there is no factual causation because the defendant had no part to play whatsoever in the death or injuries, just like in the case of Mr. White, of the victim. The second factual causation case that students really need to know is that of R versus Paget. And this is a particularly harrowing incident in which a criminal on the run used his girlfriend, his pregnant girlfriend, as a human shield while he was shooting at the police. The police shot back, and his girlfriend was killed. Now, at the trial, Mr. Paget, or his lawyers at least, argued that he didn't have factual causation. He said he hadn't killed his girlfriend. The police had, which was correct. The police had killed him. But when we asked the question, would the injury or death have happened if it hadn't been for the actions of the defendant? The answer is no, they wouldn't. His girlfriend wouldn't have died if he hadn't used her as a shield and he hadn't been shooting at the police. And so there is factual causation. And so Mr. Paget, of course, was found guilty for the death of his girlfriend.